Hey guys, this is Rumsey. I just wanted to make a quick video summarizing my thoughts on Proposition 122. Now, unless you've been living under a rock, which is a very fair way to live your life, don't let anybody tell you otherwise, you might have heard that there is going to be a psychedelic measure on the ballot in Colorado this Tuesday, which by the time you're seeing this is probably the day of the election. And I just wanted to make this video to, offer some perspectives to those who haven't voted yet, who might be still on the fence, to kind of give an overview of where I fall and what my experience has been like in working with this whole political apparatus the past year. I'd say it's been basically a year since we first caught wind that new approach was going to be pushing this ballot initiative here in Colorado this year. And over this past year, there has been a lot of political drama. There's been a lot of just drama is the best way to describe it and summarize it. I don't want to get too much into the details right here in the intro, but yeah, there's been a lot that has happened here in Colorado, and a lot of different stakeholders, a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different camps, and to say the least, this initiative has definitely created a rift in the psychedelic activist community here in Colorado. And now that the election is coming up, I think it deserves a very fair overview of what this has been like, what the initiative entails, the pros and the cons of it, and what'll happen if it passes and what'll happen if it doesn't pass, and how we plan on moving forward from whatever happens. And the way I want to format this video is, first of all, I just want to mention that it's really easy for us to fall into black and white thinking and basically come at things from a very partial perspective. And just for full disclosure, I helped work on an alternative initiative, which was Initiative 61 here in Colorado, that was meant to offer an alternative solution to the policy reform at hand, after we caught wind that Prop 122, which back then was called Initiative 58, was going through the pipeline. And a lot of people from my side of the political spectrum here in Colorado have a lot of really tendentious and biased, for lack of a better term, perspective on Prop 122, and I also have my biases, but for the sake of this video, I'm going to do my best to lay things out in an impartial and holistic manner to kind of give the full gamut of what the consequences and political realities might be if this proposition passes or doesn't pass. And, to kick things off, I will probably start with the reasons people have had grievances against Proposition 122. And before I can actually get there, let me just give a sort of a bird's eye view of what is in Proposition 122. So Proposition 122 has two main components. So the first component is what I will call the partial decriminalization of 5 entheogenic substances. Those substances are psilocybin, psilocin, mescaline, dimethyltryptamine, and ibogaine. And what I mean by partial decriminalization is that it would basically, remove criminal penalties for the use and possession and cultivation of these substances, but it affords the government, the state of Colorado, the authority to set limits on what personal possession might be. And this was a major sticking point during the negotiations early on about how the final language of this initiative would look, but I can get into that detail later on. And in this limited decrim, you would be able to have unlimited home cultivation of these substances, and there would be provisions for gifting and harm reduction services. And the other component of Proposition 122 is that it would create a state-regulated access program, which would entail there being licensed healing centers and licensed practitioners who would be able to administer these experiences. And within that regulated access model, there would be 15 people appointed by the governor of Colorado, Jared Polis, Jared is up for election on the same day as this ballot, so it's likely he'll win, but whoever is the governor of Colorado will be tasked with appointing 15 people who are going to set the rules for regulation in how the regulated access program is going to be implemented. And those are the two main components of Proposition 122. And just to kind of give a brief rundown of how this initiative even came onto the table. So back about a year ago, SPORE, which is the Society for Psychedelic Outreach, Reform, and Education, announced to the community that there were going to be a few town hall meetings in regards to getting community perspectives and feedback on a potential ballot initiative that was going to be run here in Colorado. And in these town hall meetings, we kind of got little glimpses of what was simmering under the table. In that new approach was in the process of crafting language that would be submitted to the state for this ballot initiative. And in these town hall meetings, we were able to basically allow the community to voice, their concerns, their perspectives, their experiences, their grievances with, how industry with drug policy reform has played out in the past, especially with cannabis, and people who are, stakeholders in psychedelics, including psilocybin and others, would be affected by change in policy and stuff like that. And in these town halls, there was I think most of them are on record. They've been recorded, and I think if you reach out to SPORE, you can get recordings of these town halls just to hear the different varieties of community perspectives. But in these town halls, we kind of got to see what the collective id of the community wanted to see or what they didn't want to see in some prospective ballot initiatives. And, out of those early town halls, we were able to basically form basically a small group of activists who formed the Responsible Reform Council of what is called the My Coalition. So SPORE put together the My Coalition to basically curate community voices and allow and kind of create an outlet for the transmission of the perspectives of the local Colorado community. And within the My Coalition was the Responsible Reform Council. And at some point, I think it might have been November of last year, the Responsible Reform Council met with representatives of New Approach PAC, which is the organization that has written and is sponsoring Proposition 122 in Colorado. And in those meetings with New Approach PAC that happened in the offices of Vicente Cederberg, which also had a role in drafting the language, a lot of the leaders of the Responsible Reform Council of the My Coalition voiced, very particular concerns about the language of Proposition 122. And one of those really eminent concerns was that the early language of Proposition 122 included black letter limits to possession. And what that means is the language actually set that for personal use, you could have up to 4 grams of active ingredient. And what that means is 4 grams of active ingredient is not 4 grams of, actual substance. It means 4 grams of, active ingredient. So for example, psilocybin mushrooms probably contain 1% actually psilocybin. The rest of it is just fungal matter. So under that hard letter limit, you could possess, let's say that 1% value is accurate. You could probably have up to 400 grams of mushrooms, which at face value, seems like a pretty high number. But in principle, a lot of decriminalization activists have deep reservations against setting personal limits to possession, insofar that there are no limits to possession on other substances such as alcohol. Alcohol has been regarded as one of the most harmful substances to humanity, and we've already gone through prohibition of alcohol. And when the prohibition was ended, they never put limits to how much alcohol you could possess, and there still are no limits to how much alcohol you can possess. Right now, if you go to the liquor store and ride off, with the entire backseat of your car filled with, like 1,000, gallons of vodka or 50, 30 cases of beer and pallets of wine, or if you have your entire car packed to the brim with as many alcoholic beverages as you can squeeze in there, and you get pulled over by a police officer, and they look in the back seat of your car, nothing. You're off scot-free. No limits to possession. The officer would probably say, "Have a nice party," and you're on your way. And then there's the other argument, which posits that, what authority does the state have to limit our possession of nature? These substances to many are deemed sacred. They're deemed very powerful medicines of the earth, and there's kind of the notion that why would the state, why should we afford the state the right to limit our possession of these substances that are regarded as medicines and have very profoundly remarkable safety profiles. These substances are very difficult to abuse insofar that they produce rapid tolerance. They are nearly impossible to overdose. I don't think there is the LD50, which is the lethal dose, the lethal dose that kills half of a population, is unknown for most of these substances. I don't think there is a known LD50 for psilocybin. So, according to the scientific record, we don't have any record of what the requisite dose is for overdose because it's so high. So for all intents and purposes, these substances are impossible to overdose on. They are resistant to addiction. They actually have anti-addictive properties. So the notion that the state ought to set limits to personal use, personal possession, is not logically sound. And the other argument is that setting limits to possession is how you create scarcity. And in a scenario where there is different modalities of access to these substances, such as the personal use, personal cultivation versus corporate access. Whereas the first thing I mentioned, the former, you would be able to cultivate your own substance. You would be able to acquire from members of the community who cultivate, neighbors, friends. And then the latter modality is, you would be able to acquire the substance from, corporatized settings, such as licensed healing centers, or maybe later down the road dispensaries or whatnot. And these might be even synthetic products. It seems the case that there would probably be no limits on the latter, such that a corporation that is tasked with producing synthetic psilocybin that they dispense, there would probably be no limits. They probably that would undermine the whole business model. So when you set limits to possession on personal use, but you don't set limits on the corporations, that creates scarcity and basically allows the corporate entities to capture the market share. So that no limits on corporations, but limits on personal possession kind of creates an inequity of access. And so, yeah, there was a big disagreement about the inclusion of black letter limits to possession in the early drafts of Proposition, or it was Initiative 58 back then. Now it's Prop 122. And eventually those black letter limits were removed, and a new approach kind of used that as a pretext, like, hey, we listened, we took out the limits. But what actually happened was, instead of including black letter limits in the language of the proposition, they actually deferred the authority to set limits to the state of Colorado, which would be probably DORA, the Department of Regulatory Agencies. And yeah, so that was one of the initial concerns that leaders of the Responsible Reform Council and the My Coalition had about this measure, was the setting of limits. And if this were to pass, it seems that the governor would appoint 15 people who would determine the rules and ostensibly set the limits to possession. And one of the major concerns about this is we don't know what that might be. We don't know who the 15 people are going to be. It could swing one way or another, meaning the 15 people that the governor will appoint, on one side of the spectrum, let's just say best case scenario, the 15 people that the governor appoints to advise DORA, they might be very involved people who have a history working with these substances, who know how community engages with the substance, who have deep knowledge about the safety profile of these substances, and have a familiarity with the substances and how community engages with the substances. And they would probably set rules that are not excessively prohibitive, that don't create a lot of burdensome barriers to access, and for community to offer services that are kind of more grassroots, community-based, friends doing community ceremony or having singing circles or group ceremony, things to that effect. And then the opposite side of the spectrum, the worst case scenario, is that the 15 people that get appointed by the governor are people that are what I would call the mainstream establishment, the old guard. People who are connected to industry, people who are connected to lobbyists, people who are connected to corporate interests, and would approach this from a sort of fear-based, top-down regulatory control system, where the rules that they would advise to DORA might be excessively prohibitive, would create inequitable access, would basically try to pigeonhole access of these substances to a set of corporate-backed modalities that would, in a sense, pigeonhole access to these experiences in the licensed healing center model, where there might be some capital requirements, there might be a lot of red tape, a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of barriers to access that would kind of like leave out a lot of the more grassroots legacy practice modalities of experiencing these substances, akin to what I mentioned earlier. That would be kind of like group ceremony or people having advertisable experiences with these substances that are not within the sterilized confines of a corporatized licensed healing center, with therapists, licensed practitioners who would be expected to undergo a state-sanctioned licensing program. And that's another thing that will come about from this. So the way the language is written currently is there's two parts to the regulated access. So the first part is that these experiences would have to be experienced at a licensed healing center. And the licensed healing center, the regulations are still unknown, but we're not sure if these licensed healing centers would what kind of regulatory oversight they would have, if they would have to be in a special facility, and what other zoning is probably not the right word here, but there might be some exclusions in what space might be allowed to be shared with these licensed healing centers. That's one side, is the location, the setting would have to be a licensed healing center. And then the other side of it is these experiences would have to be administered under the guidance of a licensed practitioner. Now, DORA, the Department of Regulatory Agencies, is going to be tasked with creating a special license of a practitioner who's going to be able to administer these experiences. And it is still yet to be known what the extent of the licensing might be, and how inclusive that licensing protocol might be for people who are practitioners of these experiences and these substances, who don't necessarily have like a therapy background. There are people who come from indigenous lineages, or people who come from modalities of experiences that are not quite cultivated into the Western therapy model. For example, people who administer these experiences with the setting of a singing circle, or people who administer these experiences with sound healing, or people who administer these experiences with nature walks, or things to that effect. There's an entire universe of how people have cultivated modalities to have these experiences. And it is yet to be known how encompassing these regulations might be to those modalities. It seems the way that the language is written, especially with the emphasis on healing and natural medicine, is that there might be a sort of tilt towards the medicalized schema, the medicalized infrastructure of here's a therapist, you're here to heal, and yeah, we're not sure if how exclusive that specific modality might be, and whether or not the 15 people appointed by the governor are going to be more encompassing of alternative modalities of access to the substances. So those are a few of the major concerns that the community of activists that were a part of the My Coalition have voiced in opposition to Prop 122. And yeah, and one of the major, an overarching kind of theme in this is, corporate control, corporate consolidation. And one of the ways to kind of drill the point home is that, people who are into, so what I would call equitable access, people who are into, allowing the legacy community to engage with the substances the way they've been engaging for decades, for centuries, have a reason to be suspicious about how the corporatization of these substances would affect access and liberation of these substances down the road. One scenario that I can carve out is, let's say Prop 122 passes, and the the licensed healing centers and the licensed practitioners, that becomes the law of the land, and there is all of a sudden going to be a new cohort of stakeholders who are financially vested in this new industry. Now, what might come about from that is that these stakeholders, such as the owners of the licensed healing centers, or the people in charge of creating the training programs that are afforded licensing to be practitioners of the substance, and then there's going to be the entities that are sanctioned with the affordance of producing the substances, and then there's going to be the organizations or companies tasked with testing the substances, and there's going to be an entire economy, industrial complex emerging from this change in the legal landscape. So let's say that this new cohort of stakeholders, 122 passes, and they are going to abide by whatever regulations are initially set by DORA. And let's say that this group of stakeholders, we all know how capitalism works. Capitalism is designed to maximize profit. And we can even posit, let's say that a corporation is fronted by a CEO who perhaps, let's say, has a good heart, has the right intentions, is not about trying to consolidate the industry and box out competition, despite, how innate those proclivities are in capitalism. But let's say that, even if a company has, a CEO with a good heart, at the end of the day, if they ever become a publicly traded corporation where they have shareholders and they're on the stock market, shareholders are their primary impetus, their primary incentive, their primary motive is to maximize profit and dividends for shareholders. And if the board of directors determines that, hey, the CEO is not operating in a way conducive to maximizing profit, that CEO might get voted out ousted and replaced with someone else who is going to be more inclined to maximize profit. So there is kind of an attractor that yields systems of corporate control and capitalism that will inevitably lead to an MO that is inclined towards maximizing profit. And one of the primary ways that a corporation might try and consolidate the industry and maximize profit is by stomping out competition. So let's posit a scenario where we have, an economy, an open market where people who seek out experiences with these substances might be inclined to look at the different alternatives. One primary offering on the market would be to access these experiences through the state-sanctioned license healing centers with the licensed facilitator. And then another modality of access might be finding a community circle where people would have these experiences with a song circle or with a meditation group or with a yoga group or you name it, something more grassroots. And the corporate entities would probably see kind of this like grassroots community-based ways of accessing these substances, these experiences as competition. And that sort of competition undermines their bottom line. And we might see things, some talking points from these industry people along the lines of we're the ones doing it the safe way, they're doing it the unsafe way. And, and an important thing to note is the people who get their foot in the door the first are going to have a huge advantage in terms of financial leverage. And these corporations that get their foot in the door first with these license healing centers and the licensed practitioners, they would all of a sudden have all this money lining their bank. And what might they do with that money? They might hire lobbyists. And what are those lobbyists going to be in charge of? Positing to our lawmakers, it would probably be rhetoric in favor of the interests of these corporations. And to kind of elaborate on that point, we might hear things along the lines of, oh, hey, we have all of these really meticulous safety protocols. We're following the state regulations. We're doing it the safe way. These substances are highly unpredictable. They're destabilizing. They're unsafe. They have to be done in settings which are highly controlled and have medical monitoring and XYZ. We're doing all these things to ensure safety. Those other people, like the grassroots, they probably won't call them the grassroots. They might call them the black market, the underground, or whatever terminology they'll use, are doing it the unsafe way. They're doing it without the intensive regulatory protocols that we have. And with that line of logic, they'll say, hey, we need to ensure that all of the demand for these experiences is done in a way that is in compliance with these, arbitrary regulations. And that whole shebang, that whole talking point system is simply just a pretext. And this could be a cynical perspective of mine, but at the end of the day, all the talking points about safety and regulation and stuff like that is simply a way for these corporate interests to box out competition and to try and do a land grab and to consolidate control of these experiences. Because if these experiences become regulated and there's going to be legally sanctioned ways to access these experiences, these corporations don't want to compete with some of the more grassroots legacy modalities of having these experiences. They would want to consolidate control. And that is one of the major concerns of the vulnerability that we impose upon ourselves if we do pass Proposition 122, is that the corporations would acquire all this financial leverage to lobby our lawmakers to impose a system to rig the new economy in a way that favors corporate consolidation, in a way that excludes the modalities that other people may choose to pursue these experiences. And this issue in particular was one of the major motivating points of why I was involved with proposition or Initiative 61, which would have done a blanket decriminalization of these substances instead of trying to couch the decriminalization within couch a partial decriminalization within a regulatory model, as Prop 122 does. And I will just mention that Initiative 61, which did not make it on the ballot, simply because of lack of signatures, was a half page long and would have simply removed the same 5 substances from the Controlled Substances Act, meaning they're no longer controlled substances in the state of Colorado, and people can choose how to engage with the substances at their own will, rather than having a regulatory framework pigeonholing modalities of access and setting limits to possession, as Prop 122 might do. So yeah, that's kind of a brief summary of what the major concerns are with Prop 122, insofar that it's only a limited decriminalization. The state will have the authority to set limits to possession, which are unknown, and that it leaves the new lay of the land vulnerable to corporate consolidation, and a lot of the community voice of the local community was kind of like boxed out. New Approach kind of like showed up in Colorado and says, hey, we see that your state is a very fertile state for policy reform. We are going to come in and drop this ballot initiative here in your state. We'll meet with the local community at the table once or twice and pay lip service to taking in community feedback. But at the end of the day, we're just going to push forth this ballot language, whether you like it or not. And that's what happened. And a lot of the community, the grassroots community here in Colorado felt very sidestepped. We felt very stepped on, and basically our toes were stepped on by New Approach, which was an out-of-state organization that came in Colorado, bypassed the local grassroots community that was already hard at work in creating policy reforms, such as the people that worked on Measure 301 in Denver, which decriminalized psilocybin in Denver, and also the activists in Boulder, including myself, who had been working on local decriminalization measures in Boulder. There's a whole giant group of people who are the local grassroots psychedelic activists that were mostly just bypassed in this whole conversation. So in terms of involvement of the local community, that was also a huge issue. And that was kind of like a lot of the downsides to Prop 122. But I will, on the other hand, offer a sort of I'll say the pros of what might happen if 122 passes. So to its credit, Prop 122 has provisions for expungement from your record. So if a person has a criminal record from use, possession, cultivation, sale, or I'm not sure the exact specifics of how involved the different aspects, criminal acts might be. But to some level, there is an expungement. So if a person has a criminal record from some detail, you guys can go in and look at the exact detail of what might get expunged, but there are provisions for expungement in Prop 122. There are also some pretty good provisions for home cultivation. So I think the way it stands is home cultivation would be unlimited, and there are good provisions for gifting the substance. So the partial decrim may yet... we have yet to see what the limits to personal possession might be if you're out and about, but I think at home there are unlimited cultivation, unlimited possession at home. That might change if you're out and about and in possession of substance. And just to kind of circle back, I know I said that I was going to speak about the pros, but another con, probably one of the major cons that I might have breezed over is that the full extent of the regulations that we might see with Prop 122 is not known. We are voting to give the governor the authority to appoint a group of 15 people that are going to set the rules. And, I kind of laid out, there's a worst case scenario, there's a best case scenario, it might land somewhere in between, and we don't know where that in between is going to be. Some people say that Jared Polis is, a really cool progressive guy, and some people might say that, well, Jared Polis is connected to people in industry and corporate interest and stuff like that. And, the cynic in me says, who are the people that typically have the ear of the governor and elected officials? People that typically have the ear are old guard people, lobbyists, industry people who have kind of that political reputation of having those industry connections and those old guard establishment connections that might not be entirely in favor of liberating the substances in the way that the grassroots community deems most fit. So, we are voting on regulations that are not known. That is probably one of the more things in Prop 122 that give unease. Back to the pros. So, probably the biggest pro of Prop 122 is that there's going to be way fewer people are going to be arrested for using these substances, which is huge. And it's basically common sense at this point that people who are stewards or facilitators of these substances, which are creating lots of personal transformation. These substances are I don't want to go into the whole spiel about how people are finding profound experiences with psychedelics, but the notion that people should be going to prison for using, possessing, and facilitating these substances is hugely backwards. And the fact that this proposition would decrease the amount of people that are being arrested for this is probably its biggest selling point. Anything that ends the unjust prosecution and arrest and imprisonment of people for engaging with these substances that have been a part of this land longer than they've been prohibited. These substances go back thousands of years on this land. Psilocybin and mescaline-containing cacti, all these things have been part of legacy and indigenous traditions for years. And their prohibition is actually what is strange. These substances have been a part of the regular use of the inhabitants of this land longer, thousands of years longer than they have been prohibited. So prohibition is the weird thing that needs to be undone. The fact that Prop 122 would lower the amount of arrests is probably its biggest selling point. The other pro that I just mentioned is it does have decent provisions for home cultivation and gifting and home use and stuff like that. And just to kind of give a little bit of a summary of, where the kind of the broader mainstream kind of receptivity to this measure has been. It's interesting to see the different angles that the opposition has come at for this substance. And so people who are in what I would call the psychedelic activist community, there is a cohort of people who are a part of that community that have expressed opposition to 122 because they deem it too compromising. It makes too many compromises insofar that it creates this regulatory framework that is going to pigeonhole access, and it gives the state authority to set limits to personal possession, and it empowers corporate entities to practice a lot of leverage and perhaps rig the system in a way that favors the corporate consolidation. And if I mentioned this already, it's worth mentioning again. It might set limits to personal possession, which is something that is a huge problem insofar that it creates scarcity and it limits our right to nature, the right to medicines that people deem sacred. So that's kind of like where the grassroots psychedelic activist opposition comes. They deem it too compromised. Now, on the other hand, I will mention that the psychedelic activist community is kind of a bubble. It's kind of like an insular group of people that kind of like have their own perspectives and systems of thought and epistemologies and whatnot. On the other hand, when the word of Proposition 122 came out and received a lot of mainstream attention, it was really interesting to see what kind of opposition from the mainstream that was very different from the kind of opposition that came from the like the grassroots communities. So the people on the grassroots are opposed to 122 because it's deemed too compromising, too closed, too regulated. And now a lot of the mainstream opposition to 122 comes from the fact that it is deemed too open, too permissive, not regulated enough. And this is something that really caught me off guard. Now, if we look into some of the op-eds that have been published in opposition to 122, for example, let me just pull some up. There is an article, a letter circulated by Blue Rising Together, which is signed by a bipartisan coalition of 30 public officials in Colorado, many of whom are Democrats, who have expressed rhetoric opposing this from the right, from a conservative perspective. There is a local representative that represents some districts around Boulder and the mountains, and I won't mention her name, but she penned an op-ed opposing 122 because of it's not regulated enough. It's too permissive in so far that it allows people to have unlimited home grows. And then there was an op-ed published by one of the activists who is an executive of Blue Rising Together, as well as a Boulder City Council member, Mark Wallach, which caught me by surprise, opposing 122 because they're using basically outdated and facile rhetoric that's kind of like not up to the state of knowledge, saying things along the lines of, "Oh, mushrooms aren't medicine," or and something along the lines of having unlimited home grows would allow kids to have access to it, and just like some of the classic trite fear-mongering war on drugs rhetoric that we've seen around all substances, not quite recognizing all the scientific data and efficacy. The scientific data showing the efficacy of these substances to be very conducive to treating many conditions such as treatment-resistant depression, PTSD, a whole suite of conditions. You can look up the clinical trials. There's about, I think, more than 30 conditions are being investigated in clinical trials with psilocybin. Completely ignoring all the publications coming out of Johns Hopkins and Imperial College London and other universities showing the safety and efficacy of these substances. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that a lot of Democratic lawmakers are expressing opposition to 122 from the right, from a conservative point, which was really revelatory to me, because when we are in our insular group of psychedelic activists, we kind of like our Overton window is really, really, really shifted to the left, whereas the Overton window of the mainstream voter base, it probably isn't remotely that far. There's Overton window of the psychedelic community is all the way over here, whereas the mainstream society, the Overton window is still kind of over here. So to see, lawmakers who, are Democratic, who typically, vote more liberally on issues like this, to see them oppose it from the right was a huge, huge concern for me. Which begs the question, what if 122 fails? What will happen if 122 fails? So if it fails, I will mention that us activists in Boulder are going to continue to work very diligently and go full force ahead, full steam onwards to get a local decriminalization measure passed in Boulder and beyond, hopefully Boulder City and Boulder County. And we'll see what kind of ripple effects that would have. So we're going to continue to go full steam ahead with our local activism here in Boulder if it fails. But what about statewide stuff? So I will mention that when it comes to the putting something on the statewide ballot, my experience with working with Initiative 61 taught me a lot about what it's like to work with the political system and what it takes, the level of organization required, the level of funding required to get something put on the ballot statewide. Number one, I learned that gathering signatures to get something on the ballot takes an army. It really, really takes an army. Usually, so the requirement is like 125,000 ballpark estimate. But most of those signatures are invalidated, so it usually takes about 200,000 signatures to get something on the ballot. And collecting 200,000 signatures is a huge, huge, huge undertaking. To assemble an army of volunteers who are going to do this, out of the goodwill of their own heart, is a huge undertaking. It would probably take a very large army of volunteers, probably hundreds of volunteers who are going to do this, on their free time. That probably wouldn't be enough to tip the scales to garner enough signatures. And New Approach was able to get Measure 58, now Prop 122, on the ballot by basically buying their way onto the ballot. So they hired a Utah-based organization to pay canvassers to gather signatures. And I think ultimately they dumped about $2.8 million in the effort to gather signatures to get this on the ballot. A lot of that money came from New Approach PAC. Most of that money came from New Approach PAC. There's a few articles that disclose some of the funders, some of the donors to New Approach PAC. So there is a lot of big money financing that's involved in getting something like this on the ballot. And I think currently, up to this point, all of the money that New Approach has spent on Prop 122. This includes gathering signatures and campaigning and all of the expenditures that they've totaled on Prop 122. I think it amounts to 4.6. Let me just double check that number with you real quick. I have the $4.59 million. So just let that number sink in. $4.6 million. That is a lot of money. And in order to, raise that money, people, you can fall on the cynical side of things. You could fall on the optimistic side of things. But a lot of that funding comes from people who might be interested in an ROI. They see if there is going to be legalization of psychedelics in Colorado that gives them an opportunity to invest in some of the stakeholders, some of the companies that are going to emerge from this change of the industry, and they'll get an ROI. They'll get a return on investment. So say they invest, let's say $20,000 on this initiative, and then they invest once it gets passed, and then they invest in another $50,000 on a new corporation that is going to bring them a good dividend, a good return. There's probably that side of it, and then you could even say there might be even the side of just philanthropists who are just really generous and donating the money because they believe in it, and they just want to see psychedelics legalized or decriminalized and stuff like that. But in my experience in working with the coalition of activists in Colorado, people just aren't willing to donate big money for something that's a blanket decrim. And perhaps I just haven't run into the right philanthropists. But for the most part, it seems that donors are more willing to put down big money if they see that there's going to be an opportunity for industrial involvement. There's an opportunity for an economic engagement in a way that would be workable with how they run their finances currently. So all this to say that I am a bit skeptical in the ability of the grassroots community to be able to raise millions of dollars to bring a subsequent ballot initiative to the table. I think that raising big money seems to be the only way to get something on the ballot here in Colorado, and that's just the nature of the beast. That is just an unfortunate reality of the political system. Is a lot of times it's pay to play. In order to gather enough signatures, it's for the most part you got to pay canvassers. Initiative 61, which I worked on, we tried to gather signatures. I think with all of our volunteers, with all of our activists, with all of our community engagement, we were only able to garner about 5,000 signatures. 5,000 out of 200,000. That's like about less than 3%. Less than 3% of the required amount of signatures we need to gather. And yeah, it's a really daunting task to be able to gather the amount of signatures without big money investment. So basically, what I'm trying to say here is the only way to, let's say Prop 122 passes, then we go back to the drawing board and try and get the community to assemble a new ballot initiative that would, try to get on the ballot. There's going to be a lot of very glaring obstacles that are going to, get in the way of that. The first obstacle is what I just mentioned, which is that unless we get big money donations, like millions of dollars, it's going to be nearly impossible to be able to have the resources to bring something else to the ballot. And I hope I can be proved wrong about that. I really do hope I'm wrong about that. If 122 fails and we all return to the drawing board and try to bring something new to the ballot, I really do hope that there is going to be some sort of pathway to receiving big money donations from people who are more interested in the philanthropic side of things, like donating to support decriminalization just because that is the right thing to do, rather than trying to see an ROI. But the cynic in me seems to believe that acquiring millions of dollars of donation might have to involve there being some sort of corporate financial incentive, economic incentive side of things, that's something I hope to be proved wrong on. So that's the first obstacle in the way of a future ballot initiative, which is we would need big money support in order to be able to get something on the ballot here in Colorado. And the other obstacle is seeing the just the mainstream Democratic reaction to Prop 122, the opposition coming from the right, even though the lawmakers are on the left. And that to me seems to be a very huge concerning obstacle, because if those of us in the psychedelic community are opposed to Prop 122 because it's not open enough and too compromising, and our Democratic lawmakers who are typically vote liberal on stuff like this, their opposition to 122 comes from it being too open, too permissive. It tells me that if we were to go back to the drawing board and try to advance some sort of ballot initiative that is more liberal, more open, more less restrictive, and more on the decriminalization and unlimited decriminalization and stuff like that, I have an inkling that would probably receive a more vociferous rejection from some of these mainstream politicians who would probably come out in opposition to that. And that's deeply concerning to me. And I think that what that means is this is now an opportunity to start forming relationships with these lawmakers and to try and give them some more information, some more education, some more up-to-date contemporary sources on the safety and the efficacy of these substances, and this is not to say that the situation is fixed and that these politicians are incorrigible, and that they're always going to be coming from this very fear-based mentality, but basing the future trajectory based on how lawmakers have responded in this current political moment. It does seem to be a very troubling concern that a lot of the Democratic lawmakers, who we would expect to be allies on this issue, have actually come out in opposition because they deem 122 too open, too permissive. So yeah, that's kind of like in a nutshell the political dynamics that we have at hand. The psychedelic activist community has come out against 122 because it's too restrictive, too compromising, and the mainstream Democratic political establishment has come out against it because it's too open, too permissive. So that's kind of the political dynamic. And then the other concern, just to summarize, that I put forth is that that might be an obstacle to overcome if we were to try and return to the drawing board. So it's a very complex issue. If 122 passes, it's not going to be the end of the world. I think that there is still a lot of opportunity for wiggle room to influence the 15 people that get appointed. So there's two ways we can do that. One way is by doing whatever we can to to come up with, a list of activists in the community that would be great representative voices on this panel, and we give this list to Polis, and we publicize it, and we somehow get this list of people that have been vetted by our grassroots community as trusted representatives who would be able to offer advisement to DORA in a way that would be conducive to allowing, equitable access to these experiences. And then another way is after these 15 people are appointed, let's say we did or we didn't manage to influence who the appointees are, but let's say after the 15 people are appointed, there's still an opportunity there to influence their decision making and how they advise DORA. And then there's going to be, further ways to engage the political system. There might be some public comment here and there. There might be ways to, advance some sort of legislative changes to the initiative. So all in all, if 122 does pass, it's not going to be the end of the world. Us activists are going to continue working our butts off to ensure that whatever regulatory stuff gets entertained is going to be passed by the community. And if 122 fails, that's an opportunity for us to return to the drawing board and craft some new policy that is going to be a little bit more in line with what a lot of the legacy community desires to see in this, what the indigenous community desires to see in this, with the caveat that if we were to make a future ballot initiative a little bit more open, a little bit more liberal, a little bit more permissive in use, that might activate a little bit more chagrin and opposition amongst the mainstream political establishment. So there's a lot of factors at play here, and that's kind of there's probably a few more things that I might have wanted to say about this, digging deep down, but I've been speaking for about an hour, and if you made it this far, congratulations. Thank you for sticking around to hear my entire perspective on Prop 122. All in all, I can't really fault anybody for voting one way or another. A lot of my my contemporaries, my colleagues are in vociferous opposition to 122, and some of my friends are in vociferous support of 122. I would not fault anybody for voting one way or another, and whatever happens, there's going to be definitely future opportunities to stay involved and to influence the trajectory of how this gets implemented, how this unfolds. Implementation is going to be a huge component of how this unfolds. And yeah, if you're watching this on election day, go vote. Your vote matters, and vote your heart. And yeah, thanks for listening. And we're all part of this battle to liberate the medicine, to liberate our cognitive liberty. And yeah, here's to another season of activism and civic engagement and liberation of the medicine. Rumsey checking out. Peace.